I remember the smell of my father's study, old leather, cigarette smoke, and the particular silence of a room where boys were made into men. I was 7 years old the first time I sat across from him in that chair, legs dangling because I wasn't tall enough to reach the floor, and he told me something I would spend the next 4 decades trying to either fulfill or forget. "You are the steady one," he said, not looking up from his papers. "You don't cry. You don't complain. You carry on." I nodded, because nodding was what the steady one did. I carried that sentence like a stone in my chest all the way through primary school, through the rough corridors of secondary education, through the first terrible years of university where no one knew my name, and I didn't know how to make them learn it. I was good at invisibility. I was excellent at performing competence. I showed up, I delivered, I maintained the face of someone who had everything under quiet and dignified control. What no one knew, what I told no one, not a single soul for the longest time, was that on certain evenings, when the apartment was empty and the city outside my window had settled into its nighttime hum, I would open the bottom drawer of my wardrobe and simply look. It wasn't dramatic. There was no lightning bolt of revelation, no moment of sudden costume and mirror. It was quieter than that, the way most real things are quieter than the stories we tell about them afterward. The first piece had been a mistake, or what I'd called a mistake when I needed an explanation for myself. A market stall, a busy afternoon, I'd picked up a soft blouse in pale lavender thinking it was something else, and by the time I realized what it was, the vendor had already taken my money and turned away. I'd brought it home, folded it, placed it in the drawer, and then stood for a long time wondering what I was going to do with it. What I did was nothing, for 3 weeks. And then, one rainy Tuesday, when my supervisor had publicly criticized my quarterly report in front of the entire team, when I had walked home through the wet streets feeling like something scraped off a shoe, I opened the drawer. I held the blouse for a long time. I ran my thumb along the stitching at the collar. And then I sat down on the edge of the bed and breathed, just breathed, in a way I hadn't breathed in months. That was the beginning, though I didn't know enough to call it that yet. What I knew was only this. Something about the act of holding that soft fabric was like setting down the stone my father had placed in my chest. Not throwing it away. I wasn't naive enough to think it could be thrown away. Just setting it down for a moment. Just giving my arms a rest. The years of childhood had given me a very specific kind of armor. I was the eldest of 3 boys. My mother was a woman who expressed love through organization and meal schedules rather than through anything that resembled tenderness. Not because she lacked the capacity, I think now, but because she had grown up in a house where tenderness was considered an indulgence. We were provided for. We were structured. We were prepared. What we were not was understood. I watched my brothers navigate this in their own ways. The middle one became loud, funny, boisterous, the one who filled rooms and deflected depth with laughter. The youngest withdrew into technical things, computers and engines, the company of machines that didn't require emotional translation. And I became the steady one, the responsible one, the one who carried on. I want to be clear about something because I think it matters for what comes later. I was never unhappy in any dramatic sense. My life was not a tragedy. I had enough food, enough education, enough eventual professional success to be considered, by most measures, fortunate. What I lacked was not circumstances but language. I had no vocabulary for the interior. I had no tools for the territory inside myself. The blouse in the drawer was my first tool, though I didn't know how to use it yet. Over the following months, I acquired a few other things, nothing elaborate, nothing that required explanation or courage in the purchasing, just small soft things. A pair of cotton gloves in cream. A simple skirt in dark navy that I told myself was practical and unremarkable. A single earring I found on the ground outside a cafe one morning, which I kept in the inner pocket of my jacket for reasons I never quite examined. I did not wear any of it. Not yet. I arranged these things in the drawer, and sometimes I looked at them and sometimes I closed the drawer and went to make tea and didn't think about them for weeks. What was happening, I understand now, was not costume or performance. It was something more like archaeology. I was beginning to excavate, very carefully, the parts of myself that had been covered over by decades of being the steady one. And archaeology, real archaeology, is slow. It moves in millimeters. It stops frequently to assess what has been disturbed and what should not be rushed. The drawer was my excavation site. The small soft things were my findings. And the evening I first held the pale lavender blouse against my chest and looked, briefly, at my reflection in the wardrobe mirror, that was the moment I understood that what I was looking for had always been there, patient and quiet, waiting for me to develop the skill to see it. Her name was Mrs. Rahana, and she was 73 years old, 5 feet tall, and the most quietly formidable person I have ever known. I met her because of a leaking pipe. She lived in the apartment directly above mine, and one winter morning the water came through my ceiling with polite but persistent determination, and when I knocked on her door to investigate, she opened it wearing a housecoat covered in embroidered roses and looked at me with the expression of someone who had already assessed my entire character and found it provisionally acceptable. "I know about the pipe," she said. "Come in and have tea while I call the building manager. Standing in the hallway is not something I do." I came in. I had tea. The building manager was called with surgical efficiency. And then, for reasons I still cannot entirely explain, I stayed for 2 hours. Rahana was a retired schoolteacher who had outlived a husband, 2 of her closest friends, and what she called the general goodwill of modernity. She was acerbic, precise, and possessed of an uncommon generosity that she expressed primarily through feeding people and refusing to let them leave. Her apartment was small and absolutely full of books stacked in systems that only she understood, full of photographs, full of the particular density that accumulates in the home of someone who has lived fully and kept everything. I began visiting on Sundays. It started as a check-in because she was elderly and alone, and it seemed like the reasonable thing to do. But within a month I understood that the person being sustained by these visits was not her. She had a way of asking questions that didn't sound like questions. "You seem like someone who has been carrying something for a long time," she said one afternoon, pouring tea without looking at me. "Most people your age who visit old women on Sundays are either doing penance or looking for something they didn't get enough of as children." I laughed because it was either laugh or say something true. "Both, probably," I said. She nodded as if I had confirmed a hypothesis and handed me my cup. It was Rahana who, about 8 months into our friendship, first introduced the dress. She had been sorting through boxes. She was giving things away to various charities, she said, before, as she put it, the alternative sorting process becomes necessary, and she produced it from a box with the matter-of-fact air of someone setting out a vegetable. It was extraordinary. There is no other word. It was a tea-serving dress from what must have been the 1950s, pale pink with a white collar and cuffs, and a skirt that flared with what I can only describe as architectural confidence. It had small pearl buttons down the front and a sash at the waist, and an abundance of delicate lace trim that qualified, by any reasonable standard, as frilly. "I wore this," she said, "when I was 24 and newly married and learning what it meant to make a home. It meant making tea for people. A great deal of tea, for a great many people." She paused. "I don't know why I kept it. I kept everything. But I kept this especially. I held it because she handed it to me. The fabric was remarkable, this lived-in softness that comes only from decades of careful keeping. "You should try it on," she said. I looked at her. "I'm not being peculiar," she said, already turning back to her boxes. "I'm being practical. It won't fit me. It might fit you. You're slim enough. And more importantly, I think you need to understand what it feels like to wear something that was made purely for the act of caring for others. Not performing. Not achieving. Just serving tea." I want to say I responded with some dignity. I want to say there was a sophisticated negotiation of this moment. What actually happened was that Rahana disappeared into the kitchen, and I stood in her sitting room holding the dress, and something in me that had been waiting a very long time simply said, yes. I changed in her small bathroom, because she had gestured toward it without turning around, because she had the intuition of someone who had taught children for 40 years and understood when a person needed a door to close. Looking in that small mirror above her bathroom sink, I did not see what I expected. I had been braced for absurdity, for the comedy of wrongness, for the evidence that this was something I had no claim to. What I saw instead was something I don't have adequate language for even now. I saw someone resting. That is the closest I can get to it. The face in the mirror was mine, The same face that had presented quarterly reports and navigated difficult conversations and maintained the expression of someone who had everything under quiet and dignified control. But the body in the mirror had set something down. I came out. Rahana was in the kitchen, already filling the kettle. She turned, looked at me for a moment with the complete lack of drama that was entirely characteristic of her, and handed me a tray. "Now," she said, "you serve the tea." And so I did. I carried the tray into the sitting room. I poured. I arranged the cups. I sat across from her in that extraordinary dress, and I drank tea with a 73-year-old retired schoolteacher on a Sunday afternoon, and she talked about her husband and the early years of her marriage and what it had meant to her to make a home, and I listened with my whole self in a way that I had not listened to anything in years. Before I left that day, she folded the dress carefully and placed it in a bag.
"Keep it," she said.
"I can see you have a drawer for things like this." I did not ask how she knew. What Rahana had given me, beyond the dress, beyond the afternoon, was permission. Not the verbal kind, not a declaration or a formal granting of anything. The quieter, more durable kind. The permission that comes from being seen by someone who's seeing you trust and having them look back at you without alarm. I began to develop, in the months that followed, what I came to think of as a practice. That word is important, practice. Not habit, which implies automaticity. Not routine, which implies obligation. Practice, in the way that musicians practice and meditators practice, a deliberate returning to something that requires and rewards attention. Sunday mornings became the architecture of this practice. I would wake early, before the city found its voice, and I would make the bed properly, not just straightened but made, with the same deliberateness that Rahana brought to everything she did in her home. I would boil water and prepare tea in an actual pot, not a bag dropped in a mug, and while it steeped I would open the wardrobe. Over the years since that first Sunday, the collection had grown with intention rather than impulse. The frilly dress was its heart, hung carefully, handled carefully. Around it had gathered other things, a soft cardigan in dusty rose, a pair of simple flats in white that I had ordered online without drama, a cotton slip that I wore sometimes on warm evenings simply because the way it felt against the skin was, there is no better word, kind. The act of dressing was itself the practice. I moved slowly. I paid attention to each thing, to the weight of the sash, to the way the skirt settled, to the particular quality of presence that arrived when the transformation, and I used that word carefully, was complete. Transformation sounds large. What I mean is smaller and more accurate. Shift. A shift in register. Like moving from the formal language you use in professional correspondence to the voice you use only with yourself, both genuine but differently pitched. In the professional voice, I managed. In this other voice, I felt. I would sit then at the small table by the window with my tea, and I would write in a notebook, not journaling in any structured sense, just words. Images. Things I had noticed during the week. The particular blue of the sky one morning. The sound a door made in the office hallway that had, inexplicably, made me feel suddenly very young. The way someone's laugh in a restaurant had pierced something in me that I hadn't known needed piercing. I understand now, learning the interior. Learning its geography. Learning which territories had been neglected the longest, and which parts still, despite everything, had things growing in them. Loneliness had been the constant weather of my adult life. Not the dramatic kind. Not the loneliness of abandonment or grief, but the chronic, low-grade kind that comes from never being fully known. I had colleagues I liked and acquaintances who became occasional friends, and a sister-in-law who was warmer toward me than my own brothers had ever managed. I was not isolated. I was not without connection. But there is a difference between being in the company of people and being known by them. I had spent decades in company. I had rarely been known. The Sunday practice was, in its way, my first sustained effort to know myself. To be, as Rahana had modeled so naturally, both the one who serves and the one who is served, both the host and the guest in my own interior life. The dress was not a disguise. I want to be precise about this. It was never about becoming something other than what I was. It was about creating the conditions under which I could access parts of what I already was, the parts that the steady one had been required to set aside. the gentleness, the capacity for care, the attention to small, beautiful things, the willingness to slow down and be present in a moment without managing it. I spoke to a therapist about this in the second year of the practice. A careful woman, unhurried, who listened in a way that felt like being held without being touched. I told her about the drawer, about Rahana, about the Sunday mornings. I used clinical adjacent language at first because that was my reflex and she let me use it, and then gently she asked me to try describing it without the clinical language. "What does it feel like?" she said. "In your own words. Not what it means. What it feels like." I thought about it for a long moment. "It feels," I said finally, "like being allowed to speak quietly. Like all my life I've been in a room where the acoustics require you to project, and this is a smaller room. A room where a quiet voice reaches the walls." She nodded slowly. "That's worth protecting," she said. It was. I had not known until she said it that I had understood it that way. But I had. I was protecting something. The way you protect anything tender, with careful hands and appropriate shelter and the patience to let it grow in its own time. The gentle transformation, as I began to call it in my notebook, was not about the dress. The dress was the symbol, the physical anchor for something that was happening in dimensions the eye couldn't see. The transformation was in how I moved through the rest of the week, in how I had begun to notice things I had trained myself not to notice, in how I had slowly, almost imperceptibly, become someone who allowed himself to be gentle. 3 years into the practice, something changed at work. My junior colleague Amara came to me in distress. A project collapsing, a client unhappy, the particular emergency that feels, when you are 26 and early in your career, like the end of things. She sat across from my desk with the expression of someone bracing for the formal disappointment of a superior. What I said to her surprised us both. "Close the door," I said. "Sit down properly. Tell me the whole thing from the beginning, and don't edit it for me. I don't need the professional version. I need to understand what's actually happened." She blinked. Then she sat down properly. Then she told me the whole thing. I listened with the same quality of attention I brought to Sunday mornings, without managing, without projecting forward to solutions before I'd fully received the problem, with the particular stillness that the small room requires. When she finished, I didn't immediately respond with strategy. I said, "That sounds genuinely difficult. How are you?" She started to say she was fine, which was the professional reflex, and then she stopped, and something in her face shifted in a way I recognized. "I'm scared," she said. "That's reasonable," I said. "Let's work on the problem, and you're allowed to still be scared while we do it." We solved the problem. The client was managed. The project was recovered. But what I remembered afterward was not the solution. It was the moment when Amara had been allowed to say she was scared and had not been required to set it aside in order to be helped. I had become, without planning it, a different kind of leader. The kind I had never had. The kind that Rahana had been to me, practically effective and humanly present at the same time. The gentle transformation had migrated outward. That was what I recorded in my notebook that Sunday. It migrates. You cannot keep it contained in a drawer or a Sunday morning. When you learn to be gentle with yourself, you carry that learning into every room you enter. Not as performance, as nature. The way a person who has been properly fed no longer eats with desperation. My therapist, when I told her this, used a phrase I have returned to many times since. "You've learned to lead from the inside out." I had spent 40 years learning to lead from the outside in, from the expectations of others inward, adjusting my interior to match the required exterior. The steady one. The one who carries on. The one who manages. I had been so skilled at this that I had believed for most of my life that the management was the person. The practice had shown me otherwise. The management was a skill. The person was what the management had been managing. And the person, the actual interior person, when I finally let myself meet him on those quiet Sunday mornings in the soft pink dress with a frilly skirt, sitting at the window with his tea and his notebook, was someone I had not expected. He was tender. He was curious. He had opinions about the quality of light in different seasons and strong feelings about the proper way to make a bed and a capacity for wonder that had been waiting, patient, and uncorrupted, underneath all those decades of projection and competence. He cried at things. Not the dramatically appropriate things, not at funerals or films designed to produce tears, but at small, unexpected things. At Rahana, now in her late 70s, patting my hand and saying, "You've become easier in yourself," with the satisfaction of someone who had correctly predicted a long-term outcome. At a pigeon on my windowsill one morning, sitting in the sun with its feathers puffed, doing nothing at all, requiring nothing from anyone. At old photographs of my parents when they were young before the study and the leather and the cigarette smoke, when they were just two uncertain people trying to figure out what kind of people they were going to be. The dress hung in the wardrobe on weekdays, not hidden, not displayed, just there, the way anything that belongs somewhere is just there. I had stopped needing to explain it to myself. It was part of the furniture of my actual life, not a secret life alongside the real one. This, I think, was the key shift, the realization that there was only one life. The Sunday mornings were not an escape from the life. They were the center of the life, the practice that gave the rest of it its quality. What happened out there, the work, the relationships, the ordinary machinery of existing in the world, had better texture because of what was cultivated in here. I had been taught to understand self-care as a kind of maintenance. Oil the machine so the machine keeps running. What I had learned instead was something richer. That care is not maintenance. Care is the practice of paying attention to what is actually alive in you and tending it, the way you tend anything you value, with consistency, with gentleness, with the understanding that growing things require different conditions at different times and cannot be rushed. Rahana gave me the dress, but what she had really given me was the model, the example of a person who had moved through a full life, through loss and difficulty and the ordinary accumulation of years, and had arrived at a place of profound settledness. Not happiness as a permanent condition. Settledness. The quiet confidence of someone who has learned to live in their own interior with something approaching ease. I wanted that. I had not known I wanted it because I had not known it was possible. You cannot want what you have never seen. She had shown it to me. In a small apartment full of books and photographs, over many Sundays, over many cups of tea. Rahana died in October, quietly, the way she had done most things. She had been declining for some months, not dramatically, just the slow recession of a tide, and I had been visiting twice a week by then, helping with practical things, sitting with her in the afternoons. She was smaller at the end, but no less precise. Her questions still had the quality of not quite questions. Her assessments were still, to the last, accurate. "You're not scared anymore," she said to me about a week before she died. She was sitting up in the bed with a cup of tea she was only pretending to drink, and looking at me with the particular expression I had learned to read over 5 years, the one that meant she was satisfied. "Of what?" I said. "Of yourself," she said. "You came to me the first time, and you were terrified of yourself. Not of me, not of the world, of the person inside you that you hadn't met yet." She set down the cup. "You've met him now." I thought about the person in the bathroom mirror, the one in the pale pink frilly dress, about the Sunday mornings and the notebook and the small table by the window, about Amara and the therapist and the way I had changed at work without quite noticing the change, about the pigeon in the sun, about my father's study and the stone in my chest, and how many years it had taken me to understand that setting it down wasn't weakness. It was, in fact, the only way to use your hands for anything else. "I've met him," I said. She nodded. "He's good," she said. "I always thought so." The dress is still in my wardrobe. It will always be in my wardrobe. Not as a relic, Rahana would have been impatient with relics, but as what it always was, a tool for a practice. A way of arriving every Sunday morning at the quiet room. The quiet room is not a place. I want to be clear about that, in case it helps anyone reading this who is somewhere I recognize, somewhere in the years before, carrying the stone, maintaining the armor, performing the competence. The quiet room is not a destination. It is a condition of attention. It is what happens when you stop managing yourself long enough to meet yourself. I did not know, at 7 years old, sitting in my father's study with my legs dangling, that the sentence he gave me, "You don't cry, you don't complain, you carry on," would become both the shape of my life and the thing I would spend decades learning to gently, respectfully, finally set down. I carry on. I still carry on. It is too deeply woven into the fabric of who I am to simply remove, and I am no longer certain I would remove it if I could. But I carry on differently now. I carry on the way someone carries a cup of tea, with both hands, slowly, attentive to what is held, careful not to spill what matters. On Sunday mornings, I make the bed properly. I boil the water and let the tea steep. I open the wardrobe, and I take out the pale pink dress with the frilly skirt and the pearl buttons and the white lace collar, and I put it on with the same deliberateness I bring to anything I value. I sit at the small table by the window. I pour. I write in the notebook, sometimes coherently, sometimes just words that want to be in the world. The city does its morning things outside the window. Light comes in at the angle it always comes in, particular to this hour, and this place, and this life. And I am, in the quiet room, exactly what I've spent so long becoming, a person who knows how to serve tea and receive care, and sit in the soft company of himself without fear. That is the whole of the transformation. It is not large. It is not loud. It is gentle. It was always going to be gentle. That was, as it turned out, the only way it could have ever worked.